Imagine this. It's a damp August day, 1984. You're out on the vast peatlands of Lindo Moss in Cheshire, England. There's this mechanical excavator just, churning slowly through the dark, wet soil. And then suddenly its arm pulls up something totally unexpected, a fragment of human skin.
Yeah, exactly. And the police, they were called immediately because just the year before, they'd actually found this remarkably preserved head of a woman nearby. So they were still actively working a decades-old missing person case connected to that find.
Right. So on the surface, it really does sound like the start of some modern true crime thriller, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. At the time, the initial response was very much focused on, a contemporary crime scene investigation.
Yeah.
But what unfolded was, well, it was far from solving a modern crime. It turned out to be the chilling emergence of a very ancient one.
Ancient? How ancient are we talking?
Well, forensic work, combined with careful radiocarbon dating, it quickly showed that these new remains, the ones that would become famous as Lindo Man, they didn't belong to someone who'd vanished recently. No, they belonged to a young man who lived and, crucially, died violently almost 2,000 years ago, right slap bang in the middle of the Roman occupation of Britain.
Wow. 2,000 years. So not a modern murder victim at all.
Not at all. He was an archaeological enigma and just one of hundreds, literally hundreds, of these so-called bog people who've surfaced from these peculiar wetlands scattered right across northern Europe.
And what an enigma they really are. I mean, these individuals, they're pulled from the peat with their skin, their hair, even the actual contents of their last meals unbelievably intact. They really embody this profound paradox, don't they?
Huh.
They're invaluable scientific specimens, yes, but they're also just startlingly human individuals.
Well, they really are. It's quite uncanny.
And they offer this unparalleled, almost intimate window into a past that, otherwise left no written records of its daily life. These bodies give us direct, visceral evidence of diet, health, appearance, and often the really brutal violence that characterized some ancient European societies.
Absolutely. But for every answer they give us, for every secret they sort of reluctantly reveal, they seem to pose even deeper, maybe more unsettling questions about humanity and belief systems back then.
Exactly. Like, why? Why were these men, women, even children put into these very specific watery graves?
And why, in so many cases, did they meet such brutal, really violent ends? It forces you to ask, were they revered sacrifices to gods we no longer remember? Or were they maybe tragic victims of some kind of ancient justice system? Or perhaps something even more complex, a reflection of societal values we can, frankly, barely comprehend today.
Their uncanny preservation, it's almost lifelike sometimes. It truly challenges our whole understanding of life and death in antiquity.
It really does.
And that, for you listening, is our mission today. We're taking a deep dive into this enduring mystery of the bog people. We'll unpack the unique, fascinating science that allowed them to be preserved so remarkably. We'll meticulously map their distribution across millennia and huge geographical areas. And then we're going to dissect the competing, often intertwined theories that try to explain those violent deaths. We'll explore all the opinions on what this all means.
And we'll also confront their modern legacy, too. Everything from how they help us reconstruct the intricate details of ancient life, right through to the complex and still evolving ethical questions around their study and public display.
By the end of this deep dive, you'll hopefully hear the whole story, a lot of which many people just don't know. And you'll also get a nuanced understanding of all the different views on what these incredible finds truly mean, and maybe what they could mean for our grasp of the human past. Okay, so let's start with how this happens, this astonishing preservation. It isn't the result of some, ancient, deliberate mummification process, not like the Egyptians did with their elaborate rituals.
No, not at all.
Instead, this is a purely natural phenomenon. It's born directly from the unique, almost magical chemistry of their watery graves. It's what we're calling an alchemical bog, almost like the earth itself performed this incredible sort of accidental, natural embalming.
That's a great way to put it. It really is like alchemy.
So how does this remarkable natural process actually work? What's the secret?
Well, it's really a convergence of very specific environmental factors. And understanding this unique environment is, well, it's the absolutely essential first step to even beginning to comprehend the mystery of the bog people. At its core, peat is basically this dense, spongy, soil-like material. It forms from the partial decomposition of organic stuff, mostly plants, in really waterlogged environments, bogs, fens, moors.
Okay, so decomposing plants in wet areas.
Right. And these peatlands are incredibly important ecologically. They're actually the largest natural terrestrial carbon store on the entire planet.
Right.
Huge carbon sinks. But the key ingredient, the absolute star player for preserving human soft tissue in these particular bogs, is sphagnum moss, often just called peat moss.
Sphagnum moss. Got it.
Over thousands of years, layers and layers of this sphagnum accumulate in these basins that have really poor drainage, and they create this distinct sort of dome-shaped landscape that's fed almost entirely by rainwater, not by groundwater or streams. These specific formations are known as raised bogs, and they are the ideal, almost like natural laboratory environments for preserving human soft tissue.
Raised bogs. Okay, so it's the sphagnum and the rainwater combination in these raised bogs.
Exactly. Their unique properties create this perfectly balanced chemical cocktail that effectively, well, mummifies pretty much any organic material that gets deposited within them.
A chemical cocktail. Okay, so let's break that down. You said it needs 3 crucial factors to really work. The first one you mentioned is maybe the most critical, the profound lack of oxygen, an anaerobic environment, right?
Precisely. The waterlogged soil of a peat bog is just so saturated with water, it essentially pushes out all the air, creating oxygen-free conditions. And without oxygen, those aerobic bacteria and fungi, the common tiny organisms that are the main drivers of rapid decomposition in a normal burial, they simply can't survive or function properly.
So no oxygen, no decay, bugs, makes sense.
By denying these microorganisms the oxygen they need to break down organic matter, the bog effectively halts the process of putrefaction almost immediately.
Okay, factor 1, no oxygen. What's the second crucial factor?
The second one is incredibly high acidity. As the old sphagnum moss decays down in the bog layers, it releases something called humic acid, often just called bog acid. This natural process dramatically lowers the pH of the bog water. It makes it extremely acidic, often reaching pH levels similar to, say, household vinegar.
Wow, like vinegar? That's pretty acidic.
Yeah, it is. And this highly acidic environment acts as a really powerful preservative. It effectively pickles the body's soft tissues, kind of like how you might preserve vegetables or fruit in pickling brine. This acidity is a defining characteristic of the preservation chemistry. Any idea that the water might be alkaline is just plain wrong, scientifically speaking. It's this pervasive acidity that really does a lot of the heavy lifting in preservation.
Okay, so no oxygen, high acidity like vinegar. What's the third key ingredient in this mummy juice?
The third part is a unique mix of specific organic compounds that the bog produces. These include naturally occurring polyphenolic compounds called tannins.
Tannins, like in tea or wine, or like tanning leather.
Exactly like tanning leather. They're actually the very same type of chemicals used in that industrial process. These tannins soak into the body's tissues, gradually hardening the skin and turning it that characteristic dark brown or almost leathery black color that we often see on bog bodies.
Fascinating. It literally tans the skin.
It does. And working alongside the tannins is another specific carbohydrate polymer called sphagin. This is released by the sphagnum moss as it dies. Sphagin does 2 things. First, it binds with nitrogen, which further stops any remaining bacteria from growing. And maybe even more interestingly, it participates in a complex set of chemical reactions called the Maillard reaction.
The Maillard reaction, isn't that what happens when you brown meat or toast bread?
The very same. It's the chemical process responsible for that browning and developing flavor when you cook certain foods. In the bog, it contributes further to the browning and tanning effect on the skin.
That's incredible. So the bog is basically pickling, tanning, and even sort of cooking the body all at once through natural chemistry.
In a manner of speaking, yes, it's a really remarkable, almost, as you said, alchemical natural process. And what's truly fascinating here is the paradox of preservation that results from this unique chemical soup. Some parts are preserved in extraordinary detail, while others are completely obliterated.
A paradox. How so? What gets saved and what gets lost?
Well, what's primarily preserved are materials rich in the protein keratin. So the skin, the hair, and the nails are often found in near-perfect, sometimes startlingly lifelike condition. I mean, think about Groball Man forensic experts could still take his fingerprints over 2,000 years after he died. That's how good the preservation of the skin can be.
Fingerprints after 2 millennia. That's mind-blowing.
It really is.
Yeah.
Clothing made from animal products like wool or leather also tends to survive remarkably well. And internally, soft tissues like muscles, organs, even the brain sometimes can be preserved. And that allows for incredibly detailed analysis, like figuring out the individual's last meal from their stomach and intestinal contents.
But you said it's a paradox, so what's the downside? What doesn't survive this process?
Here's the twist, and it's a big one.
Uh-huh.
What is almost universally lost is the skeleton.
The bones. Why?
The highly acidic water. It relentlessly leaches the calcium phosphate out of the bones. Over centuries, this causes them to completely demineralize. The bones literally become soft, pliable, almost like rubbery cartilage. If you look at an X-ray of a bog body, the bones often appear as just these ghostly outlines, or sometimes they're barely visible at all.
So the acid that pickles the skin dissolves the bones. Wow.
Exactly. And then you have the immense crushing weight of all the overlying peat layers building up over centuries. Peat is incredibly heavy when waterlogged. This pressure often flattens, distorts, and even completely fragments these already softened skeletons.
Yeah.
That's why many bog bodies have that kind of deflated, almost squished rubber doll appearance. It can be quite a haunting visual.
Yeah, I can imagine. And I guess that makes it hard to tell if injuries happen before death or just from the bog pressure afterwards.
That's precisely the challenge. This demineralization makes distinguishing between perimortem trauma injuries from around the time of death and postmortem taphonomic effects, damage caused by the bog environment itself, incredibly difficult. Take Grobar Man again. For a long time, a prominent fracture on his skull was interpreted as proof of a fatal blow, the thing that killed him. But modern, non-invasive CT scans were crucial. They revealed that it was actually a postmortem indentation, just damage caused by the immense pressure of the bog slowly compressing his softened skull over centuries.
So the CT scan changed the whole story of his death.
Fundamentally, it highlights just how critical these advanced scientific techniques are for accurately interpreting the evidence and avoiding, potential misinterpretations based just on visual inspection. Making that distinction is key to understanding how some of these individuals might have died.
So this kind of amazing mummification, it's actually really rare then. It's not something that happens every time someone ends up in a bog.
Oh, absolutely not. It's exceedingly rare. It's by no means an automatic outcome of just being placed in any old wetland. It truly requires what scientists often call a perfect storm of very precise conditions, all coming together at the right time.
A perfect storm. Okay, what are the ingredients for that storm?
First, the body absolutely has to be placed in a specific type of bog. A raised bog is ideal because of its high sphagnum moss content and the fact it's fed by rainwater, which is naturally low in minerals. Second, the deposition needs to be rapid. The body has to be quickly submerged in the water or buried deep in the peat. This prevents that initial aerobic decay with oxygen from setting in. Any exposure to oxygen early on would let decomposition get a foothold and ruin the whole process.
Okay, raised bog, quick burial. What else?
And crucially, scientific studies strongly suggest the season of deposition is a determining factor. It seems the body has to be placed in the bog during the cold winter or maybe early spring months, specifically when the water temperature is consistently very low, below about 4 degrees Celsius or 39 degrees Fahrenheit.
Why so cold?
At that sort of frigid temperature, bacterial growth is severely inhibited. It slows everything right down, giving the cold, acidic bog water enough time to fully saturate the tissues and kickstart that preservation process before any widespread decomposition can really happen.
It's an incredibly specific recipe, isn't it? Raised bog, quick burial, and has to be freezing cold.
Exactly. A very precise set of circumstances.
So what does this detailed science tell us about what ancient people might have known? Did they understand this complex chemistry, you think?
In a modern scientific sense, highly unlikely. They wouldn't have understood the, intricate biochemical reactions involving tannins and sphagnin. But there's this parallel practice of preserving bog butter. Have you heard of this?
Bog butter? No, what's that?
People in Ireland and Scotland especially used to bury large quantities of dairy fat, butter, or sometimes even meat fat, packed in wooden containers or animal hides deep within peat bogs, presumably for long-term storage, maybe over winter or even for years.
They used bogs like natural refrigerators.
Essentially, yes. And this practice strongly suggests they had a practical, empirical knowledge of the bog's extraordinary ability to conserve organic matter. They knew it worked for food. So if they knew a bog could stop butter from spoiling for ages, it's entirely conceivable they anticipated, or perhaps even intended, that it would do the same thing for a human body.
Ah, okay. So maybe putting a body in wasn't just disposal, but a way to keep it whole.
Perhaps. This practical wisdom suggests that placing a body in the bog might have been seen as a way to provide their gods with a complete intact offering. A body preserved perfectly for the divine realm, untouched by the natural decay that would consume it anywhere else.
That adds a whole different layer of potential meaning, doesn't it? Knowing it preserves things might have made it the perfect place for a special kind of burial or offering. It helps us start thinking about what this could have meant to them.
Precisely. It connects the natural phenomenon to potential human intention.
Now, here's where it gets really fascinating for me. This whole bog body phenomenon, it isn't just confined to one small area or a short period in history, is it?
Not at all. Far from it. It represents a really widespread, incredibly long-lived tradition. It stretches across the vast expanse of Northern Europe, and it spans millennia. We're talking from the Stone Age, right through the Bronze Age, the Iron Age, even into the modern era.
Thousands of years of this practice or phenomenon.
Both, really.
Yeah.
And the highest concentrations of discoveries are, maybe unsurprisingly, found in the peat-rich regions of Northern and Western Europe. Denmark and Germany are particularly abundant. Denmark alone accounts for at least 500 individual finds, though, exact numbers can be a bit tricky because early recording methods weren't always precise.
500 from Denmark alone. That's staggering.
It is. Ireland has yielded over 130 documented bodies as well, and significant numbers have also come out of the Netherlands, the UK, and Sweden. Now, some early estimates might have been a bit inflated, but modern academic databases, which rigorously check and verify each find, still confirm hundreds of individuals have been recovered and meticulously studied.
And where are they not found so much?
Finds become noticeably less common as you move further east across the continent. There are only a handful of well-documented cases from places like Poland and the Baltic states.
Does that just track with where the bogs are?
Partly, yes. The geographical distribution partly reflects where these large, suitable peatlands exist. But primarily, it correlates with where peat has been commercially harvested for fuel over centuries. The vast majority of these discoveries weren't found through careful archaeological digs initially. They were found accidentally during industrial peat cutting operations.
Yes. Like Lindo Man with the excavator.
Exactly. So where peat was cut, bodies were found.
And what we've learned more recently through some really groundbreaking research is that this wasn't just one static, unchanging practice over all those thousands of years, was it?
No, absolutely not. It was a deeply dynamic and shifting cultural phenomenon. Recent large-scale studies, especially this comprehensive database analysis led by archaeologist Roy Van Beek and his colleagues, have truly revolutionized our understanding. They meticulously analyzed over 1,000 individuals from more than 260 distinct sites across Europe. And this work has shown, unequivocally, that bog deposition was dynamic, not monolithic. It changed in its nature, its intensity, and its geographical focus over thousands of years.
So we can't just lump them all together and say bog bodies were X.
Precisely. It forces us to move beyond seeking a single, simplistic explanation for all bog bodies. We have to embrace a much more nuanced view, looking at specific times and places. In fact, we can now identify distinct chronological phases in this practice, each with its own characteristics. Breaking it down like this really brings the evolution of the tradition to life.
Okay, let's walk through that. What are these phases?
Okay, we start with phases 1 and 2. These cover a huge span of time, from the early Neolithic right through the Bronze Age. So, roughly 9,000 BCE down to about 1,000 BCE. The very earliest depositions we know of are notably concentrated in southern Scandinavia, primarily Denmark, southern Sweden, and Norway.
And what are these earliest finds like? Are they the well-preserved mummies?
Interestingly, no. These early finds are exclusively bog skeletons or just partial skeletal remains. We simply don't see the well-preserved soft tissue mummies yet in this very early period. But even in this sort of nascent stage, we find the first strong evidence for violent deaths, often involving young adults, clustering specifically in this Nordic region and period.
Violence right from the start, then.
It appears so. And then later in this combined phase, the practice makes its first appearance over in Ireland and the UK, so it starts to spread.
Okay, phases 1 and 2. Early, skeletons mostly, violent deaths in Scandinavia, then spreading west. What happens next?
Then we move into phases 3 and 4, covering the late Bronze Age through to the early Iron Age, roughly 1000 BCE to 400 BCE. And this marks a really significant shift, because this is when we witness the appearance of the first true bog mummies with preserved soft tissue.
The mummies arrive.
They do, although they're still quite rare compared to the skeletal finds, which are still more common overall. Geographically, we also see a new and distinct cluster of sites starting to emerge down in southeast England. Meanwhile, The tradition continues in Scandinavia.
So it's expanding both in the type of preservation we see and where it's happening.
Exactly. The phenomenon is clearly growing in scope.
Then what's phase 5? You called this the classic era earlier.
Yes, phase 5. This covers the main Iron Age and the Roman period, roughly from 400 BCE up to about 400 CE. This is undeniably the period most people associate with those famous, haunting examples like Tollin Man or Lindo Man. The practice reaches its absolute peak intensity during this time, and new, prominent geographical hotspots come into focus, particularly northern Germany, the Jutland Peninsula of Denmark, and the Irish Midlands become really key areas.
And more mummies during this time.
Yes, the number of bog mummies increases substantially in this phase, although statistically, skeletal finds still make up the majority of discoveries overall. But what really characterizes this period is what researchers often describe as extreme violence. Many individuals show clear evidence of what's called overkill.
Overkill, you mean multiple injuries?
Yes, multiple, distinct, and often seemingly gratuitously brutal, fatal injuries. It suggests a grim purposefulness, maybe a strong ritualistic intent behind their deaths. It's a very prominent feature of this phase.
Okay, Iron Age Roman period. Peak intensity, mummies increase, hotspots in Germany, Denmark, Ireland, and this extreme violence or overkill. What about after the Romans? Phase 6.
Phase 6 covers the medieval and modern periods, so from around 400 CE up to about 1900 CE. And here we see a truly remarkable geographical shift. The practice of bog deposition largely disappears from its former heartlands in Denmark and Germany. Instead, it becomes almost exclusively concentrated in Ireland and the central and northern parts of the UK.
Wow, it completely moves.
Pretty much, yeah. And in a fascinating reversal of the earlier trends, bog mummies now actually predominate over skeletal finds in this later period.
More mummies than skeletons later on. That's interesting. Is the violence still there?
Violence remains common, yes, but the causes of death seem to become far more varied. This is the phase where we start to see the first clear evidence for suicides and accidental deaths, like drownings, appearing alongside what are still clearly homicides.
So the bog's role might have changed, not just for ritual or punishment anymore.
Exactly. It seems the bog transformed, in some places, from being primarily a site of ritual or execution to also becoming sometimes just a place of personal tragedy.
This whole chronological breakdown is fascinating. It completely changes the picture from just bog bodies to something much more complex and evolving.
Absolutely. What's truly fascinating here is how this detailed framework reveals that the bog body phenomenon wasn't one single tradition at all. It was a rich tapestry of many distinct, evolving practices over millennia. The cultural logic, the beliefs, the societal motivations behind putting a Neolithic skeleton in a Danish bog were almost certainly very different from those driving the burial of a medieval mummy in Ireland.
Right. Different times, different places, likely different reasons.
Precisely. This dynamic, multi-phase perspective forces us away from hunting for that single, elusive, universal explanation for all bog bodies. Instead, it pushes us towards a much more nuanced, regionally specific and temporally specific understanding of the complex variations in this ancient practice. This dynamic view is absolutely crucial if we want to understand what these finds truly mean and what they could mean for our grasp of the past.
And this framework also highlights something else you touched on, a significant preservation bias and how we tend to think about bog bodies, right?
Yes, definitely. The iconic image that instantly jumps into most people's minds is almost always that of the eerily well-preserved mummy. Tollin Man with his peaceful face, or Grobali Man with his sort of fixed grimace.
Yeah, those are the famous ones.
But that popular perception is actually quite skewed. In reality, if you look at the total numbers, bog skeletons, and even just disarticulated skeletal remains, bits and pieces, are far more numerous in the archaeological record than these fully fleshed, visually dramatic mummies.
So the mummies are actually the exception, not the rule.
Statistically speaking, yes. While the mummies, with their hauntingly human faces and preserved skin, have naturally captured the bulk of both public and scholarly attention. Understandably. So they really only represent one end of a very wide spectrum of preservation found in bogs.
So to get the full picture, the whole story, we need to look beyond the famous mummies.
Absolutely. A holistic view, one that thoroughly incorporates the more numerous, though often less visually dramatic, skeletal finds, is essential for accurately tracing the true, comprehensive history of human deposition in Europe's unique bog landscapes. We need to consider all the evidence.
Okay, that makes sense. Maybe to help us visualize this diversity across time and preservation types, could you walk us through a few of the really key examples, kind of a quick catalog?
Sure, that's a great idea. Let's touch on some of the most significant ones, placing them chronologically and geographically to emphasize this changing landscape we've been discussing. We can start way back with Kohlberg man. He dates to around 8000 BCE, found on the island of Funen in Denmark. He's a skeleton, not a mummy.
8000 BCE. That's Mesolithic, Stone Age.
Exactly. He's one of the oldest bog bodies ever found in Europe. We don't know how he died, but his sheer age is just a stark reminder of the incredible power of these bogs to hold on to secrets for millennia.
Okay, moving forward in time.
Let's jump to the Bronze Age, around 2000 BCE, in County Lough, Ireland. This is Cashel Man. And significantly, he is a mummy, one of the earliest found in Ireland. He was discovered naked, pinned down with wooden stakes, and he had multiple sharp force injuries in his back, plus a broken arm.
Pinned down, that sounds deliberate and
Yeah.
violent.
Very much so. His surprisingly early Bronze Age date makes him a really significant early example of apparent ritual killing in Ireland. It actually challenged the older idea that these kinds of sacrifices only happened much later, in the Iron Age.
So he pushed back the timeline for ritual violence in Ireland.
Interesting. Who's next? Maybe the most famous. Probably Tolan Man, yes. From about 405 to 380 BCE, found in Jutland, Denmark. He's the iconic mummy everyone pictures, found wearing just a pointed skin cap and a simple hide belt, otherwise naked. And of course that plated leather thong pulled tight around his neck. Forensic analysis confirmed it was hanging, not strangulation.
And his last meal is famous too, right?
Yes, incredibly so. Preserved perfectly in his stomach was this simple porridge made of barley and over 30 different types of wild seeds and weeds. It gives us this incredibly rare, intimate snapshot of his final hours, and even the season likely late winter or early spring.
Just amazing detail. Now, wasn't there another famous one found nearby, but very different?
Yes, Greibal Man, also from Jutland, Denmark, dating a bit later, around 290 BCE. Found just 2 years after Tolan Man, but he presents a starkly different, much more brutal image. He was also naked, his body contorted, face fixed in that grimace. The bog chemistry tanned his skin dark brown and famously dyed his hair that vivid reddish color, though that wasn't his natural hair color.
And his hands were perfectly preserved.
So perfectly that, as we mentioned, they could take his fingerprints. His death was caused by a single massive wound. His throat was slit from ear to ear, severing his windpipe and esophagus. And perhaps the most intriguing detail about him is his last meal. It also contained porridge, but with a significant amount of ergot fungus spores mixed in.
Ergot, isn't that a hallucinogen or poison?
It can be both, yes.
Yeah.
Which sparked intense debate. Was he deliberately drugged as part of a ritual, maybe to induce a visionary state? Or did he accidentally consume contaminated grain, leading to sickness or convulsions before death? He really embodies that fine line between ritual, punishment, and just sheer misfortune.
Okay, let's cross over to Ireland again. You mentioned some key finds there from around the same Iron Age period.
Yes, the discoveries in 2003 were game changers. First, Old Crogan Man from the Irish Midlands, dating 362 to 175 BCE. This was just his torso, but incredibly well preserved. He was exceptionally tall for the time, about 6'6". Had these beautifully manicured nails, clearly not a manual laborer, and isotope analysis showed a diet very rich in meat, high status written all over him.
But he died violently.
Extremely violently. Stabbed, decapitated, his body cut in half, and perhaps most strikingly, his nipples had been deliberately sliced off.
Sliced off. Why?
We'll get to the theory on that. But first, his contemporary, found at the same time, also in the Midlands, Clonny Cavan Man, dating 382 to 201 BCE, also a torso and head. He was shorter than Old Crogan Man, but notable for this elaborate Iron Age mohawk hairstyle, held up with expensive, imported pine resin, basically Iron Age hair gel.
Hair gel. That definitely suggests status and style consciousness.
Absolutely. It speaks volumes. He, too, suffered extreme violence. Struck 3 times in the head with an axe, disemboweled. And just like Old Crogan Man, his nipples were also sliced. These two finds together really prompted a major rethinking of Irish bog bodies.
Okay, now let's hop over to Britain. Lindo Man is the big one there, right?
Yes, Lindo Man, dating somewhere between 2 BCE and 119 CE from Cheshire, England. The mummy who famously wore that fox fur armband. His discovery in 84 got tangled up with that modern murder case, remember, until the radiocarbon dating sorted it out. He was a healthy young man, mid-20s, well-built, about 5'8". And like the high-status Irish guys, his fingernails were well manicured, again suggesting not a life of hard labor.
And his death was particularly brutal, wasn't it? The triple death.
Exactly. Extreme, multifaceted violence. Struck twice on the head with a blunt object, probably an axe, fracturing his skull. A grope made of animal sinew was tightened around his neck, breaking vertebrae, and then his throat was cut with a sharp blade. Finally, placed face down on the bog.
Just overkill, like you said earlier.
Definitely. And his last meal adds another layer. Charred griddle cake and traces of mistletoe pollen. Mistletoe had deep ritual significance to the Druids, according to Roman writers. The whole picture for Lindoman screams ritual.
It certainly seems like it. No, it wasn't just adult men, was it? Were there women and children found too?
Absolutely. While adult males dominate the most famous finds, women and children are definitely present in the record, reminding us this wasn't exclusively a male phenomenon. A prominent example is Yide Girl from the Netherlands, dating 100 BCE to 50 CE. She's a mummy found with a woolen cloak, and she was only about 16 years old when she died. She was strangled with a woolen band and also stabbed near her collarbone. What's particularly poignant is that CT scans later revealed she had scoliosis, a curvature of the spine, which would have given her a noticeable limp.
Oh, wow. Do they think her disability played a role?
It's possible. Some researchers speculate that this physical difference might have marked her as special or set apart in some way, potentially making her a candidate for sacrifice. We can't know for sure, but it's a possibility.
And didn't they find something odd about her hair too?
Yes. Interestingly, the hair on one side of her head had been cut off or shaved, another detail that hints at some kind of ritual preparation or perhaps humiliation before death.
And you mentioned a more recent find of a woman.
Yes. Just in 2023, the discovery of the Ballymacomb's Moor woman in Northern Ireland provided another incredibly important case study. She dates from 343 to 1 BCE. These are well-preserved remains of a young woman aged between 17 and 22 who was deliberately decapitated.
Decapitated, so clear violence again.
Clear violence. And this find is significant because it further challenges that long-held assumption that bog body victims were overwhelmingly male. It powerfully reinforces the theme of ritualized violence extending to other members of the community, not just adult men.
So it broadens the picture considerably.
It does. And there are other finds too, like the Bormos woman from Denmark who might have been buried with an infant, hinting at even more complex and tragic stories that we're still trying to decipher. Each find continues to expand our understanding of what these discoveries truly mean and who was involved.
Okay, so we've seen the incredible preservation, the vast timescale, the geographical spread, the modern science used to study them, and met some of the individuals. Now let's pivot to the absolute central, most haunting question that permeates this whole study. Why? The overwhelming evidence, literally written on their flesh and bones, points to violent death in so many cases. But the precise motive, the reason behind the violence, remains subject to intense, often passionate debate. This is where we really have to grapple with what these findings mean and what they could possibly mean for our understanding of Iron Age beliefs in society.
It's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And the most prevalent, widely discussed theory, which certainly carries significant weight based on the evidence, is that many of these bog people were victims of ritual human sacrifice.
Ritual sacrifice. What's the strongest evidence pointing in that direction?
Well, first, consider the very nature of the violence we've just been talking about. That concept of overkill, which we saw so clearly with Lindoman's triple death, or the really excessive wounds inflicted on the Irish kings. It goes far beyond what would be necessary just to end a life. This extreme level of brutality, often involving multiple distinct fatal injuries, strongly suggests a kind of grim purposefulness. It feels like an extraordinary offering, something more than just a simple murder or a standard execution.
Okay, the overkill suggests ritual. What else?
Secondly, the chosen location for these depositions is highly significant. Remember, bogs weren't the normal burial grounds in the Iron Age. Cremation was much more common for the general population then. Instead, bogs seem to have been perceived by Iron Age peoples as liminal spaces, these mysterious, otherworldly realms that were neither solid land nor open water, kind of in-between places.
Gateways almost.
Exactly. They were seen as potential gateways or conduits between the mortal world and the realm of the gods or spirits. These were also sacred landscapes where communities routinely deposited other valuable votive offerings, things like elaborate bronze cauldrons, intricately crafted gold torques, valuable weapons.
You were throwing treasure into the bogs already.
Precisely. Presumably to gain favor with deities of fertility, prosperity, maybe protection. So placing human bodies in these same sacred locations strongly implies they were considered the ultimate offering, the most profound gift you could give to the gods, a direct connection to the divine.
That makes sense. If you're already putting valuable objects there, a human life would be the peak offering.
It would seem so. And finally, there are specific patterns within the finds that strongly point towards a ritual purpose. Think about the Irish kingship sacrifices we discussed, the symbolic decommissioning of a failed ruler through the slicing of the nipples that provides a clear, culturally embedded ritual framework, which actually seems to echo practices described much later in ancient Irish texts.
So there's a cultural backstory that fits.
Yes. And consider Tollan Man's last meal again, that simple gruel of winter grains and wild seeds, eaten in late winter or early spring. That timing aligns perfectly with known agricultural cycles and the potential timing for fertility offerings made to hasten the arrival of spring and ensure a good harvest. Even the almost universal nakedness of most bog bodies might have been a ritual requirement, perhaps signifying humility or purity or vulnerability before the gods. All these details, when put together, make the ritual sacrifice theory a very powerful one.
Okay, that's a strong case for sacrifice. But there's another major theory, isn't there? The idea that these were executed criminals.
Yes, that's the other main interpretation, often presented as an alternative. This theory posits that at least some bog bodies were criminals, outcasts, maybe prisoners of war, or other social deviants who were formally executed for their transgressions and then disposed of in a particularly dishonorable manner in the bog.
And is there evidence for this, like historical accounts?
The primary historical evidence comes from the Roman historian Tacitus. In his work Germania, written in the 1st century CE, Tacitus described the customs of the Germanic tribes living just beyond the Roman frontier. He specifically wrote that these tribes punished individuals they deemed cowards, shirkers, and the unnaturally vicious by pinning them under woven hurdles or branches and drowning them in miry swamps or bogs.
Wow, Tacitus wrote about drowning people in bogs. That's pretty direct.
It's remarkably specific, and this ancient account resonates quite strongly with certain archaeological findings. In a significant number of cases, archaeologists have found forked sticks, large stones or sturdy wooden stakes that were clearly used to pin the body down firmly in the peat after death.
Like with Kaffelman you mentioned earlier.
Exactly. And the famous Danish archaeologist P.V. Glob, who excavated Tollan Man, interpreted this act of pinning the body down as a deliberate desire to pin the dead man firmly into the bog. His idea was perhaps they wanted to prevent a malevolent spirit, the ghost of the executed person, from returning to haunt the living community.
So pinning them down suggests they were seen as dangerous or maybe polluted.
That's the interpretation, yes. It fits the profile of an executed criminal, or someone considered taboo, rather than an honored sacrifice. The public execution of individuals deemed socially deviant would have served as a powerful sanction, reinforcing community norms and deterring others from similar behavior. It offers a compelling, albeit darker, interpretation of what some of these deaths could mean.
So for a long time, it was basically debated as either sacrifice or our execution.
Yes, for many decades, the scholarly debate was often framed that way. A stark choice between those two explanations, forcing researchers to kind of pick a side for each body.
But you're saying it might not be that simple.
Exactly. A more sophisticated, nuanced understanding has really emerged in recent years, suggesting that framing it as a strict either is often a false dichotomy, especially for the Iron Age.
Why a false dichotomy?
Well, think about Iron Age societies. In many of them, especially where chieftains or kings held sacred power as well as secular authority, and where the well-being of the community was seen as totally intertwined with divine favor and cosmic balance. The lines we draw today between the religious and the judicial were likely non-existent, or at the very least, deeply blurred.
So religion and law were kind of the same thing.
In many ways, yes. In such a worldview, the execution of someone who had broken a major societal or religious taboo could, itself, have been seen as a profoundly ritual act. The goal wouldn't just be to punish the offender for their crime. It would also be about cleansing the community of the perceived pollution caused by the transgression, and simultaneously appeasing the gods who might have been angered by it.
Ah, so the execution is the ritual.
Precisely. Look at the Irish kings again, Old Crogan Man and Clonheven Man. If the community was suffering from famine or plague or military defeat, this was often seen as a direct result of the king failing in his sacred duty to maintain prosperity and cosmic balance. His execution in those circumstances would therefore be understood as both a punishment for his perceived failure, a judicial act, and simultaneously a ritual sacrifice needed to appease the offended deities and restore balance with the divine world, a profoundly religious act.
So one act serves multiple purposes in their worldview.
Exactly. In this integrated view, the victim could be, at the same time, a criminal and a sacrifice, a disgraced figure, and a sacred offering. This provides a much more robust and culturally sensitive way to interpret the complex evidence we see. It acknowledges that a single act of violence could carry multiple interwoven layers of meaning, judicial, political, and deeply religious for the people who carried it out. This nuanced understanding completely transforms what these violent deaths could mean, moving us beyond those simple categories.
That makes a lot more sense than trying to force everything into just one box. But it's also really important to remember, isn't it, that while this ritualized killing, whether sacrifice, execution, or a mix, seems like the most common explanation for the classic Iron Age bodies, it probably doesn't fit every single case we find.
Oh, absolutely not. That's a crucial point. The bog body phenomenon, as we saw with the chronology, spans many millennia. So other causes of death must always be considered and examined on a case-by-case basis.
Like the later finds from Phase 6.
Exactly. Our chronological analysis clearly showed that finds from the medieval and even modern periods include pretty clear instances of accidental drowning and also suicide. For those individuals, the bog wasn't a place of ritual or punishment. It was simply the tragic location of a personal misfortune or maybe an act of desperation. The bog's meaning shifted.
And couldn't some just be murder victims hidden in the bog?
It's entirely plausible. Some bodies might represent victims of simple, non-ritualized murder, with the bog serving merely as a convenient, remote, and effective hiding place for clandestine crime. We can't rule that out.
And then there are those mass deposits too, right? Not individuals.
Yes, furthermore, some sites represent entirely different phenomena altogether, highlighting the sheer diversity of human activity associated with bogs. Take, for example, the incredible site at Alkenenge in Denmark. This bog holds the disarticulated remains of more than 380 individuals.
380?
Yes, and they were all killed in a massive armed conflict that took place around the early 1st century CE. This clearly wasn't a series of individual ritual sacrifices. It seems to be the mass deposition of the casualties of war, a truly grim testament to the scale of violence that could erupt between tribes or armies in the Iron Age.
So a battlefield cleanup dumped in the bog.
Essentially, yes. And these varied cases just underscore the critical need to assess each bog body, each find, within its own specific chronological, geographical, and cultural context. No single explanation can possibly account for all of them. Each unique find truly tells its own distinct, often compelling story, contributing to the whole story, including those parts many people don't know. Now, what's truly fascinating, and maybe even more revealing in some ways, is that beyond the immediate mystery of how they died, the bog bodies function as these unparalleled biological archives. They offer us a direct, intimate, and often startlingly personal window into the daily lives, the physical health, and the social structures of past societies that, crucially, left no written histories of their own.
So they're like time capsules of the people themselves.
Exactly. By meticulously studying their preserved physical remains and any associated artifacts found with them, we can reconstruct a remarkably detailed and vivid picture of the Iron Age world. It sheds invaluable light on what life was really like back then and what that could mean for our understanding of ancient times.
And one of the most unique insights comes from their diet, right? From analyzing their last meals.
Yes, that's one of the most direct lines we have. The exceptional preservation of internal organs often allows for the direct analysis of stomach and intestinal contents, literally giving us a snapshot of a person's very last meal. This direct evidence, when combined carefully with stable isotope analysis of their tissues, like hair or bone collagen, paints a surprisingly vivid picture of the Iron Age diet.
So what were they eating? Was it all just gruel?
A common meal does appear to have been a simple but likely nutritious porridge or gruel, usually made from cultivated grains like barley, but often supplemented with a wide variety of foraged wild seeds and grasses, just like we saw with Tolan Man.
Any other foods?
Well, Lindo Man's last meal, for instance, included a type of charred griddle cake, basically a simple, unleavened bread cooked on a hot stone or metal plate. And while many meals seem to have been largely vegetarian based on the plant remains, the isotope analysis of bone and hair definitely confirms that meat was also a significant part of the diet, especially for those high-status individuals like Old Krogan Man. His tissue showed clear evidence of consuming substantial amounts of protein, likely from meat.
So a mix of farming and foraging, grains and meat, depending on status.
It suggests exactly that, a mixed subsistence strategy where established agriculture was combined with the continued importance of gathering food from the wild landscape.
What about their health? Can we tell if they were healthy or sickly?
The bog bodies provide a stark and often quite sobering look at the pervasive health challenges people faced in the past. One of the most striking findings is the near-universal presence of intestinal parasites, things like whipworm and roundworm. They've been found in virtually everybody that's been thoroughly examined.
Parasites in almost everyone. Ugh!
It suggests these infections were just a chronic, ubiquitous part of daily life and health in the Iron Age. Probably contracted through poor sanitation, contaminated food, or water. Imagine living every day with that constant burden without any modern medicine. These parasites would have caused significant discomfort, chronic fatigue, and probably made people more vulnerable to other illnesses by contributing to overall nutritional stress.
A tough existence. Anything else show up?
Yes, we also see evidence of degenerative diseases. For example, Lindoman already showed signs of osteoarthritis, even though he was only in his mid-20s. It indicates the considerable physical toll life took, even on a young man back then. And the teeth of Graubaum man showed lines indicating arrested development during his childhood, suggesting he likely experienced periods of severe starvation or perhaps serious illness when he was young.
So overall, a picture of constant challenges.
Definitely. These findings depict a population facing constant formidable challenges from disease, parasites, and probably periodic food scarcity. It paints a very real and quite gritty picture of their daily existence.
Can the bodies themselves tell us anything about social status? Or even what people looked like?
Yes, absolutely. The bodies themselves offer direct clues about social stratification and even personal appearance within Iron Age society. We already mentioned the stark contrast, for example, between individuals like Old Krogan Man and Lindo Man. Both had those soft, remarkably well-manicured hands and fingernails.
Right, suggesting they didn't do hard physical work.
Exactly. This detail strongly suggests they were members of an elite class who did not perform arduous manual labor, setting them apart from the general populace. This contrasts sharply with someone like Tolan Man, whose feet showed clear calluses and cuts, implying a life involving more manual labor, perhaps walking barefoot across rough terrain.
And Old Krogan Man was really tall, wasn't he?
Exceptionally tall, 6'6". That, combined with his documented protein-rich diet, further marks him as likely belonging to the nobility, someone whose elevated status was literally reflected in his physical stature and nourishment.
What about grooming? You mentioned Clonny Caven Man's hair gel.
Appearance and meticulous grooming were clearly important markers of status and identity, at least for some individuals. Clonny Caven Man's elaborate hairstyle, the Iron Age mohawk held firmly in place with expensive imported pine resin hair gel, it speaks volumes about his concern with fashion, personal presentation, and signaling his elite status. Similarly, Lindo Man sported a neatly trimmed beard and mustache. These weren't people neglecting their appearance.
But then you have Yide Girl with her hair cut off on one side.
Exactly. That starkly contrasts with the elaborate grooming. The hair being cut or shaved off on one side, as seen with Yide Girl and some other bodies, might have been part of a ritual humiliation or perhaps a specific preparation for death, marking them out in a different way. These incredibly specific details allow us to start piecing together these intimate aspects of their social world and what was valued or perhaps feared in terms of personal presentation and status.
And finally, what about the things found with them? Technology, tools, clothes?
These finds offer invaluable insight into their technology and intricate material culture as well. Although most bog bodies were deposited naked, the remarkable preservation of certain associated finds provides direct evidence of Iron Age technology and craftsmanship. For instance, the survival of woolen cloaks, like the one found wrapped around the Bormos woman, and various leather items, Tolan Man's distinctive cap, or the shoes worn by the Amcot's Moor woman, they unequivocally demonstrate sophisticated textile production and advanced leatherworking skills within these ancient societies.
So they were skilled craftspeople.
Very much so. We also find weapons in bogs sometimes, often crafted from bog iron. That's a type of iron ore that naturally precipitates in the peatlands. Finding these weapons not only points to the metallurgical capabilities of the time, but also maybe to the increasing prevalence of weaponry and the complex, often violent nature of Iron Age society or warfare.
And you mentioned bog butter earlier. That relates to technology too, right?
Yes. That curious and widespread practice of creating and burying bog butter, those large lumps of dairy fat, sometimes meat, packed in wooden containers or animal hides. This reveals a very practical, applied knowledge of the bog's extraordinary preservative properties used deliberately here for long-term food storage.
Using the bog tech for practical reasons.
Exactly. These tangible material remains, preserved so uniquely alongside the human bodies, help to flesh out and enrich our understanding of the lived world in which the bog people existed, labored, and ultimately met their end. They add crucial layers to what these fascinating finds mean about their society.
Okay, let's zoom out a bit now. This natural mummification in bogs is clearly unique, but it's not the only way ancient bodies have been preserved, is it? How do bog bodies compare to other famous mummies from around the world? Does placing them in that global context help us understand them better?
That's a really important perspective to take. Placing them in a global context, alongside other famous mummies, definitely helps to highlight the distinctiveness of bog preservation and, crucially, sheds light on the cultural intentions, or sometimes the sheer lack thereof, behind why these bodies were preserved in the first place.
So who should we compare them to first? Maybe Ötzi the Iceman. He's another famous European natural mummy.
Otzi the Iceman is a perfect comparison. Discovered dramatically in 1991 in the Erztal Alps, right on the border of Austria and Italy. At an astonishing 5,300 years old, he's Europe's oldest known natural mummy. And like the bog bodies, his preservation was an entirely accidental environmental phenomenon, not something humans did deliberately.
But the process was different, right? Ice versus bog.
Completely different.
Yeah.
Ötzi is what we call a dry or ice mummy. He was preserved through a natural process akin to freeze drying. The intense cold and incredibly dry winds of the high Alps rapidly dehydrated his body. Then being encased within glacier ice further protected him from scavengers and decay for millennia.
So freeze-dried versus pickled and tanned.
Exactly. Ötzi's dry preservation contrasts sharply with the wet preservation of bog bodies, which, as we've discussed, are chemically altered by that acidic, anaerobic liquid environment of the bog. And this difference has profound implications right down to the microscopic cellular level. While the bog's chemistry effectively tans and hardens the outer skin, it largely destroys the internal cellular structure. If you look at bog body skin under a microscope, you see preserved collagen, but typically no intact cells.
But Ötzi was different.
Yes, Ötzi, being freeze-dried, was preserved with his cells largely intact. This has allowed for far more detailed analysis of his internal tissues and, crucially, enabled the successful extraction and sequencing of his complete genome, something that's still incredibly difficult, often impossible, with bog bodies due to the DNA damage caused by the acidic environment.
That's a huge difference for scientific analysis. What about how they died? Ötzi wasn't a sacrifice, was he?
No, the circumstances of their deaths also differ markedly, and this gives us insight into societal practices. Ötzi was quite clearly a victim of murder. He was shot in the back with an arrow and also suffered a serious head wound. It strongly suggests he was likely fleeing one or more attackers up in the harsh mountain terrain. His preservation was pure chance, a tragic accident of nature freezing him where he fell.
Whereas the bog bodies, more intentional.
In many cases, yes. The overwhelming majority of the classic Iron Age bog bodies, particularly the ones exhibiting extreme violence or placed with offerings, are believed to be the result of intentional deposition in a very specific, culturally significant landscape. Their deaths often appear to be part of a structured social or religious practice, signifying a deliberate act rather than just an unfortunate accident.
So both are natural mummies, but the context and probable human intention behind them are worlds apart. That really helps clarify what the bog body phenomenon might mean.
It does. It highlights the likely intentionality behind many bog depositions.
Okay, now let's make the other big comparison. Bog bodies versus the icons of intentional mummification, the Egyptian mummies.
Right. This is a contrast between natural preservation and the absolute pinnacle of intentional artificial mummification developed by humans. Unlike the passive natural process happening in the bogs, Egyptian embalming was this highly complex, incredibly resource-intensive, and culturally central practice that evolves over thousands of years.
It wasn't accidental at all.
Not in the slightest. It involved precise surgical removal of internal organs, storing them in canopic jars, then desiccating the body using natron salt for weeks, anointing it with precious oils and resins, and finally meticulously wrapping it in hundreds of yards of linen bandages. This was a sophisticated, time-consuming, expensive craft performed by specialists.
And the reason they did all that was very different too, wasn't it?
Profoundly different. Egyptian mummification was primarily reserved for the elite pharaohs, nobles, high officials. It was designed with a very specific spiritual purpose in mind: to preserve the physical body as a perpetual vessel for the soul, the Ka and Ba, for its journey into a very well-defined and meticulously planned afterlife. The entire goal was to prepare the deceased for their next existence, to ensure their eternal well-being and resurrection in the field of reeds.
Whereas the bog bodies, that wasn't the goal.
It seems not. The deposition of bog bodies wasn't the standard burial rite for the general population of Iron Age Europe. Remember, cremation was far more common then. Bog burials seem to have been reserved for a select, often very specific few individuals. And rather than preparing the individual for blessed afterlife, the purpose appears to have been either a profound offering to the gods, perhaps to maintain cosmic balance or secure fertility, or it was a final, permanent disposal of a problematic, dangerous, or dishonored individual from the community.
So it wasn't really for the person being put in the bog, but more for the community or the gods.
That seems to be the crucial distinction. The Egyptian tradition was fundamentally about preservation for the individual, ensuring their personal journey to the afterlife and eternal life. The bog tradition, however, in many cases, seems to have been about preservation as an act for the community, perhaps to appease angered deities, to maintain social or cosmic order by removing a threat, or to make a powerful statement.
That distinction is absolutely key, isn't it? It really helps clarify what these different forms of preservation truly mean and what they tell us about completely contrasting ancient worldviews and beliefs about death and the body.
It really does. It underscores the unique cultural context of the bog people phenomenon. Now, this profound encounter with the past, with these startlingly preserved individuals, it inevitably raises important questions for us, right here in the present. Because the discovery of a bog body isn't just another archaeological event or a scientific finding. It is fundamentally an encounter with a human being, their lifelike appearance, those faces staring back across millennia. It powerfully collapses the distance of time, and it compels us as modern viewers, researchers, museum curators, to confront some profound ethical questions. Questions about research, about public display, and ultimately about respect for the dead. In recent decades, there's been a really critical reckoning with the legacy of these ancient individuals, challenging us all to consider what their very presence means in our modern world.
Yeah, that's a huge issue. How should museums display human remains like these? Especially ones that look so human. Is there a consensus on that?
There's no single, universally agreed upon answer, and that's probably appropriate. Different institutions have, quite rightly, adopted different approaches, reflecting evolving ethical standards, cultural sensitivities, and local contexts. Take the National Museum of Ireland in Dublin, for example. They house several key bog bodies, including Old Crogan Man and Cloneycavan Man. They've taken a particularly conscientious approach. Their Kingship and Sacrifice exhibit is located in a dedicated, clearly marked gallery, but it's intentionally designed to be partially obscured from the main visitor route through the museum.
Why obscure it?
It's a thoughtful design choice. It respects visitors who may feel uncomfortable viewing human remains, giving them the explicit choice to enter that specific gallery or to bypass it completely. This model really emphasizes visitor autonomy and treats the remains with a palpable sense of solemnity and respect.
That sounds very respectful. What about other museums? Like Lindo Man in the British Museum. Has that approach changed?
The display of Lindo Man has certainly been the subject of more public debate and ethical evolution over the years. For a long time, he was presented in a gallery alongside other Iron Age artifacts, tools, pottery, jewelry. Some critics felt that this placement inadvertently objectified him, maybe reducing him to just another artifact in a case, rather than highlighting his humanity as a once-living person.
Yeah, I can see how that might feel different.
But the British Museum's approach has also evolved significantly. A really interesting loan exhibition of Lindo Man to the Manchester Museum back in 2008 pioneered what they called a polyvocal approach.
Polyvocal, meaning multiple voices.
Exactly. It meant presenting Lindo Man alongside multiple, often conflicting interpretations of his life and death, ranging from ritual sacrifice to murder victim to executed criminal. And crucially, they actively included perspectives from a diverse range of voices, archaeologists, historians, forensic scientists, but also modern pagan groups who feel a spiritual connection to him.
So not just one official story, but acknowledging the debate and different viewpoints.
Precisely. It was a groundbreaking shift away from a single authoritative museum narrative towards one that openly acknowledges ambiguity, embraces diverse viewpoints, and encourages visitors to think critically. It reflects a broader trend in museums toward more inclusive and ethically reflective interpretation.
So what are the general standards now?
Well, professional museum standards generally now require that human remains should only be displayed if they make a truly unique and significant contribution to an interpretation. They must be accompanied by sufficient explanatory material and, above all, presented with the utmost tact and profound respect for human dignity. It's all about trying to understand what these finds mean from a multitude of perspectives respectfully.
Okay, that makes sense for display. What about the ethics of actually studying them, doing the science? How do you balance finding out more with respecting the remains?
That's the constant tension, isn't it? Balancing the scientific imperative to learn as much as possible from these invaluable remains against the profound ethical obligation to treat them with respect and dignity. This tension has led to the development of really rigorous best practice guidelines for research and excavation. Modern research, as we've touched upon, heavily prioritizes non-destructive methods whenever possible, things like CT scanning, surface scanning, isotope analysis from tiny samples over the more invasive autopsies that were common in the past. The goal is to minimize any further damage to these incredibly fragile and unique specimens.
Are there formal rules for researchers?
Yes, major institutions like the National Museum of Ireland have established formal human remains policies. These meticulously govern all aspects of care, research protocol, sampling procedures. Researchers often require specific licenses now for any analysis that involves destroying even a small part of the remains.
Now, you mentioned repatriation laws earlier, like NAGPRA for Native American remains. Does that apply to bog bodies? Do people claim them as ancestors?
That's where the ethical landscape for bog bodies is quite unique, especially compared to many other human remains held in Western museums, particularly those of indigenous peoples from North America or Australia. Unlike those cases, bog bodies generally do not have direct living descendants who can trace a clear lineage back thousands of years and claim them under repatriation laws like NAGPRA. This absence of direct identifiable descendants complicates the traditional questions of ownership and consent that are so crucial in other contexts.
So who owns them then, or who speaks for them?
Because the bodies are found within their countries of origin, Denmark, Ireland, UK, Germany, etc., they are almost universally considered part of the national heritage of that country. This allows institutions like the National Museum of Ireland or the British Museum to act as custodians or stewards on behalf of the nation. It's a model of stewardship that differs significantly from the often fraught colonial legacy surrounding many museum collections where remains were taken, often without consent, from other lands.
So the nation acts as the guardian.
In effect, yes. And the ongoing goal within the archaeological and museum communities is to develop an increasingly standardized, contextual, and deeply respectful approach to all future discoveries. This includes ensuring that the landscape and the environment where a body is found are studied with just as much care and reverence as the body itself, preserving the entire context.
Beyond the labs and museums, these bog people have had a pretty big impact on culture too, haven't they? Especially in art and literature.
Oh, a profound and undeniable impact. They've served as incredibly powerful symbols and poignant metaphors across various art forms. Their most famous artistic legacy undoubtedly lies in the bog poems, written by the Nobel Prize-winning Irish poet Seamus Heaney.
Ah, yes, Heaney. I've heard of those poems.
In iconic works like The Grobel Man, and particularly Punishment, Heaney did something quite controversial but also incredibly powerful. He drew a direct, explicit link between the ritually murdered victims of the Iron Age, like the Toland Man or Grobel Man, and the victims of modern sectarian violence during the Troubles in Northern Ireland in the late 20th century.
Wow, connecting Iron Age violence to modern political violence. That's intense.
It was, and it generated a lot of discussion. Heaney, through his poetic lens, perceived in these ancient preserved bodies a haunting resonance with what he called the long rites of Irish political and religious struggles. He used their preserved forms, their ambiguous status as both victim and maybe participant, to explore profound themes of violence, tribal vengeance, collective memory, and the disturbing complexities of complicity, how communities react or fail to react to violence in their midst.
So he saw parallels across the centuries.
He did. And while some critics have questioned the historical accuracy or maybe the appropriateness of drawing such a direct analogy, it undeniably demonstrates the extraordinary power of these ancient dead to be reinterpreted, to be imbued with new, urgent meaning right here in the present day.
So what does all of this mean? It shows they're not just relics.
Exactly. It demonstrates that the bog bodies are not merely static relics of the distant past, locked away in museum cases. They are active, compelling participants in our ongoing cultural dialogue about who we are, where we come from, the nature of violence, the role of belief, the weight of history. They offer us this unique and profound way to engage with the whole story of humanity, including the difficult, uncomfortable parts, forcing us to confront difficult truths across millennia. So as we wrap up our deep dive, think about this. From the oxygen-starved depths of the peat, the bog people emerge as these silent, yet somehow profoundly eloquent messengers from a lost world. The unique alchemy of their burial environment, that precise cocktail of acidity, cold, and anaerobic conditions has granted them this remarkable form of physical immortality. preserving their skin, their hair, even their final expressions across thousands upon thousands of years. And modern science, with its powerful toolkit of CT scanners, isotope analysis, DNA sequencing attempts, and forensic archaeology, has allowed us to carefully, painstakingly read the incredible stories written on and within their bodies.
Yeah, we've pieced together their last meals, haven't we? We've meticulously traced their final journeys using isotopes, diagnosed their ancient illnesses and the parasites they lived with, and detailed the often horrific violence that ended their lives. Through these individual, hauntingly human remains, we've constructed this vivid, if sometimes still fragmentary, picture of life in Iron Age Europe, a world of simple grain porridges, yes, but also chronic infections, sophisticated craftsmanship in leather and wool, and a complex social order that was deeply steeped in intricate belief systems and undeniably ritualistic violence. It's just an incredible window into what life meant then, offering unparalleled insight into how people lived and died.
And that central mystery why they were killed, whether as honored sacrifices or executed criminals or perhaps decommissioned kings that might ultimately be unresolvable in terms of finding a single definitive catch-all answer. But maybe that's not because of a lack of evidence. Perhaps it's because those categories, which seem so distinct and separate to our modern minds, were likely inseparable, deeply interwoven in the Iron Age worldview. The act of killing was a ritual, and the ritual was an intricate instrument of power, social control, and maintaining cosmic order. That integrated understanding is perhaps the closest we can get to what these violent deaths could truly mean.
And today, these ancient dead, they confront us, don't they, with a modern set of challenges that really compel us to look inward. They force us to navigate the complex, evolving ethics of displaying human remains, carefully balancing that universal quest for knowledge with the absolute imperative of dignity and profound respect for the deceased. And they demand that we acknowledge the extraordinary power their stories still hold, how they continue to shape our own cultural narratives, making us ask again and again, what does it truly mean to be human across these vast stretches of time?
The Bog people are far more than mere archaeological curiosities. They are, in a very real and visceral sense, the faces of the past looking directly at us. In the serene, yet somehow unsettling gaze of Tolan Man, or in the contorted grimace of Grobale Man, we see not some alien other from an incomprehensible time, but perhaps a reflection of our shared humanity, transcending the centuries. Their silent, enduring presence in our museums and in our collective consciousness serves as a powerful, enduring reminder, a reminder of the fragility of life, of the deep, pervasive power of ancient belief systems, and of the profound, dark mysteries that time cannot always erase. They call out to us across the centuries, and we are compelled, I think, to listen to their whole story, including all the diverse opinions on what these fascinating finds mean and what they could possibly mean for our understanding of the enduring, complex, and sometimes brutal human experience.